2010. Minister of Public Utilities.
Thank you very much, Mr. Vice President. You know, Mr. Vice President, as I was winding up before we went to break, I was bringing again into context where we are. And again, I know my friends on the other side do not like me to say this at all, because it just reminds them of their incompetence. And it reminds them that when they want to use the word financial mismanagement, the public is fully aware of the level of financial mismanagement and wastage that happened between the period 2010 to 2015. It is well documented. People understand it fully. So please, I beg you, do not use those words in reference to us, a people who have tried and working in new circumstances, working in circumstances where, based on external forces, our income is so much less. You know, if you will allow me, Mr. Vice President, you know, I listened last night and I heard people talk about the change in income during the 1980s, when we could all recall we went through some serious times. And during that time, you hear people talk about oil prices move from $38 down to $9. And all that happened during that time with regard to cutting in public servant wages and 10% cuts in salaries and all the unemployment that led, even the hardship led to a coup in the 1990 and all the adjustments. And that was because our income source, dollars moved from 38 to 9. Mr. Vice President, we are dealing in times now that when our income at that time was oil, our major source of income now is gas. And you are looking at times where you are hearing that our gas prices, LNG prices were up in the $14, $15, and they are now down to $5 and $6. Look at the percentage drop in our major source of export earnings, and compare that to the 38 to 9 that caused all the trauma during the 1980s. But what I could assure you is look at how the economy is being managed and how we are managing the economy now compared to then. Clearly, we continue to spend over $10 billion on social programs, and there have been not one cut in those programs. That is the type of caring government that you have. That is the type of caring government that you have that is administering an adjustment program, as we had to move this economy from $63 billion in expenditure because we could not have afforded, because income dropped to $37 billion. That is the level of adjustment that we had to make. On the other side, I heard people talk about, and again, I have to respond because these were things that were said in the debate, talked about money and expenditure on lobbyists, and whether or not we spent the right money, and whether $6 million on a lobbyist is correct. Members, Mr. President, Vice President, I want to remind this House, and again, remind this House as we venture into my next topic, and we talked about water. But I want to remind this House that this is a government that didn't spend, I would have loved if they had spent $6,000 and if it's $6 million, and in their mind got nothing out of it. And I assure you, we get a lot out of it. But could you remember, what do you think about wasting $1 billion? Try to find out how much times you could put 6 million into 1 billion. And that is the amount of money that you spent on an ill-conceived project, trying again to create more water, 11 million gallons of water, trying to create more water, ill-conceived. And to date, we got not one drop of water out of it. For that $1 billion, if it was properly spent in the right direction, we could have gotten over 80 million gallons of water from drilling of wells and from surface water. That was the opportunity cost of wasting $1 billion. And not 1 ounce of money, nothing came out of this for the country. We could have put meters, which we all agree is required to meter the whole country, $1 billion. That is what it is you gave up that have us in this position today. And you want to tell me about waste and want to use the words mismanagement and waste as adjectives to describe my government performance. Mr. Vice President, I want to move on to the statements made with regard to water. And I want to spend some time, because you're right, there is a big payment that is being made, or a payment in the adjustments of $255 million that relates to desal cut. And let me again say, people talk about whether or not it's savings or not savings. Just for the edification of all, government accounting, cash flow accounting. All right? When we talk about savings, think about it as a savings in cash flow. So if you add on the word savings in cash flow, you will understand that the word savings, because one assumes that we understand its cash flow. And therefore, if it is whatever it is, so therefore, the word savings is indeed correct, because it was a savings in the cash flow of the country. All right? That is not being smart. No, that is just trying to impart a little bit of knowledge on government accounting for you, for your edification. But you're right. The whole genesis of this came from the fact, and we continue since 1999, our simple point of desal cut, when it came in from the beginning, was very simple. We do not need to be looking at this time of using desalinated water. Desalinated water is very expensive water, 5 times the cost of normal water or other sources of water. And therefore, if you are going to use desalinated water, we should have been exploring other sources. That was our argument since 1999. I dare say that the continued decision to want to reuse that type of water, again, is the wrong thinking that led us to the concept of the Beetham wastewater project, which again was going to be wrong, conceptually wrong, and put WASA in a continued digging the nail into the financial ability of WASA and playing into the fact that we continue to have to subsidize WASA to the tune of close to $2 billion every year. Mr. Vice President, the reality of us in this country, the reality of our situation is that Trinidad and Tobago, and they talked about solutions and the fact that we don't have water. And yes, I agree 100%. The water situation in this country is something that is not acceptable. It is not acceptable. But let us understand that this water situation is not something that was created last year or 2 years ago. This is something that has been in existence for a very long time. And it has been in existence at a time when there was a lot of money that it could have been fixed. And money that could have been spent in the right direction to fix it. But it was not spent. And therefore, we arrive at a situation today where we have a water problem with less than 50% of the population that gets water on a 24/7 basis. And I hear in the other house numbers of 72% people getting water 24/7. Mr. Vice President, we living in the same country, we living on the same piece of rock and the same island, right? I think every citizen of this country, all right, 1 in 7 citizens of this country will not tell you at no time in their history that you could have gone to 10 people in a room and asked 7 people if they're getting water 24/7, and they would say yes. So again, it is fake news. Pulled from here, 72% sound like a good number. It was never 72%. That 72% of this country at no time in its history ever got water 24/7. Fake news, wrong information, misinformation, as per usual. The reality is, in Trinidad and Tobago, 50% of the population gets water on a 24/7 basis during the wet season. And less than that, 30 to 40% gets water during the dry season. That is the reality. Another reality of our lives, and again, in another house, I remember people speaking about a particular report. And it was the DHV consultants and the Leon and Partners report of 2000. And statements were read out of that report saying that, well, desalination was the thing to go because it was quick. Yes, the report said that. Yes, the report said that. But again, it frightens me with politicians, the disingenuousness. The fact that on page 3 and 4 of that same report, when I mentioned to support the position, and let's not argue, the reality is, and I said then that, and the report said that 792,000 million gallons per year of water is produced in this country. It's available. As a matter of fact, and as I reported in the other house yesterday, that number was further collaborated by the FAO and the World Bank and by the Water WRA of WASA. And as a matter of fact, the number for Trinidad and Tobago, because the 792,000 was for Trinidad. For Trinidad and Tobago, the correct figure is 840,000 million gallons of water that is available in Trinidad and Tobago from surface and groundwater. We use 10%. We use 10%. And the production of that water is 1/5 of the cost of desalinated water. Therefore, if you have so much water, 90% not being used, clearly the argument is simple. All right? You do not go around trying to solve the problem via desalination water. That's all the point that we made, and we made it since 1990. We made it since 1990. All right? The truth of the matter is, again, and that is the facts. The reality of our problem also, let's put the facts on the table. There's, at present, 99 million gallons of water a day is wasted in this country under the issues of NRW. 99 out of 232 million gallons that we produce, we get no revenue for. And that NRW, I want to be very clear, could be divided into 2 categories. Fiscal leaks, that's leaks that you see around the road, and what we will call commercial losses. And commercial losses, again, speaks to the fact that if you had a meter, there are lots of people, when they have meters, their bill actually go down. In reality, there are lots of people where their bill goes up. It goes up. And therefore, over 49 million gallons of water is lost, whereby WASA, for what they charge for, they get no revenue for it, because the usage of that water is way above that figure that is being charged. The combination of that tells you that that is where your solution needs to lie. The policies that have been done in the past of going after trying to produce more water, spending more money to produce more water, will not, and assuming that if I produce the water, I will get more water to you, that's wrong. It's a wrong approach. Conceptually, it will only cost you money to do that. And therefore, fixing the problem centers around dealing with your NRW. Fixing with the problem also centers around our ability to move water to the extremities. Where we have water is in the northeast and central. Where we have to get water to is Miaro and Cedrus. We therefore need to be able to move the water around. Those are the things that you need to center your plan around if you want to fix the problem. And therefore, again, when it was said across there and talked again glibly about no plan, there is no plan. That is not so. These are the areas that we have been concentrating on. These are the areas, having identified the problem and looking for the most cost-effective manner to deal with it. These are the areas that we have been concentrating on. And therefore, we have been working assiduously on building and repairing booster stations throughout the length and breadth of Trinidad and Tobago. And we have upgraded booster stations in Sabaneta. We have upgraded booster stations in Mackay, South Orapooch, Paramin 1, Paramin 2, Factory Road, to name a few, and I could go on and on and on and on and on. Because by improving the boosters, we are now in a position to move water to a lot of the places that were not there. And I dare say,
Mr. Vice President, respectfully, 46-1, I was warned that this was not a debate regarding water.
Honourable Minister, at this point, I think you've made your point in relation to the production of water and that whole thing of what needed to be done there and plans that were afoot. What I would ask you to do now is just tie what you're saying back to the bill that's before us, which is dealing with the movement of funds from one ministry to another. Continue, Minister.
Mr. Vice President, I accept your ruling, but it is ironic that here it is, I am just responding in my mind to a statement that no plan was ever given. And they don't know what was being said about the plan for water. And here am I trying to now educate and elaborate and give them the plan and the things that were actually in place. And here am I am being brought up that this, but I accept the ruling. I accept the ruling. And I am saying, but I am answering the points raised by learned senator about what is the problem with water and with water. And therefore, I agree and accept the fact that we do have to solve. And I will close that position by saying, we understand the problem. I have been working assiduously on the problem. And anytime you want to understand the plans that are in place, I am free to share them with you. And the population will see the benefits of the work that has been done over the past 2 years, this year, when we have done all the work that was not done before. That was not done before in the critical areas of deciding and dealing with the water problem. So that I will leave for you, and when you want to get it, we could talk about it. So, Mr. Vice President, as I said, the changes that have been identified or the movements of funds are indeed what they are. They are savings. They are cash savings. So one could use the word cash flow savings. and therefore we will then understand that there are true savings that are required, especially as it relates to the WASA situation. We are about dealing with, and I reiterate the point that we are about the current account interest rates and the interest that are being charged. Yes, as was said, it's high simply because we have to use debt. We have to use debt in a prudent manner to help to be able to manage the cash flow. And that is what good debt management is about. Debt is a buffer, and nothing is wrong with debt. As long as you could repay back your debt, debt is a buffer, and it's a management tool that we all use to help to buffer situations and to buffer cash flow management. That is what this government has been doing in prudently managing the affairs of this country and prudently bringing this country from the depths of financial disaster that they got it in to the point whereby we are now in a position to be able to pass on whatever benefits that we have done, that the country had achieved as a result of our prudency, over to the citizens. Mr. Vice President, with those few words and with the clarifications given to all the questions that I have raised, I will take my seat and I support the motion that is before us. I thank you.
Senator Obika.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President. It brings great honor to lead the year off in, I was about to say pristine surroundings, but for my haste to come here to the chamber, I nearly slipped and fell on water from the leaking roof. After $500 million being spent, one would have thought that would have been a problem of the past. But notwithstanding, there is no leak here at the moment. So it brings great pleasure to contribute to the nation's business from this chamber. The leak is only in the rotunda, which is where the public will pass. So unfortunately, they will see it. So I want to respond firstly to the Honorable Minister of Public Utilities. And Mr. Vice President, I understand the Honorable Minister's great credentials in banking because he was my mentor in banking. So I understand his credentials. And I would respect his credentials in banking. However, in politics, I think there is much to be desired. Because when one considers the situation with water in the country, and saying that producing more water doesn't solve the problem. You know, there are many persons who have significant issues with the way in which the water crisis is being managed or mismanaged, and I would leave that there because that is not the subject of this debate. I would confine my comments to the matters that are important to the nation regarding debt, finance, and areas where my former mentor in banking would be an expert on. I want to start with that figure of $31 billion. And I want to, whilst that figure may be correct, had the Honorable Minister of Public Utilities been granted more time for his presentation, on reflection, I'm sure the Honorable Minister, himself being an old boy of Presentation College, San Fernando, like myself, would have made it his duty to inform the population that when there was a change in government in 2010, there were two main issues that government was straddled with settling. The first obvious issue was the CLICO debacle. I need not remind honorable senators of the very distasteful circumstances that I can't even mention here, where you had a minister in the Ministry of Finance in the court of public opinion being called guilty for benefiting where citizens lost significant sums of monies. And I speak of none other than Karen Nunes to share. So that was a very unfriendly, unpeopled act that minister committed on the people of Trinidad and Tobago. But more importantly, the people of Trinidad and Tobago and the taxpayer was left with a bill. And I heard the Honorable Minister of Finance, who has more credentials than the sitting Minister of Finance in finance matters, repeat the statement of the Minister of Finance from the other place of this 31 billion. And to me, it is disingenuous to repeat that figure. Not in the Senate. Because there was over $10 billion, this is public record, that the incoming government under Kamala Persad-Bissessar had to settle in terms of the CLICO Trust. And for other matters surrounding that CLICO issue, $9 billion. So you had almost $20 billion that the government had to find. And Mr. Vice President, you would know we wouldn't have that kind of money sitting around in Trinidad and Tobago. We'd have made good use of it. So of that $31 billion, you have to discount immediately. And it's sad to see that the Honorable Minister has left the chamber, because I wouldn't want the Honorable Minister making the mistake of repeating those wholly erroneous, egregious, ignorant and uninformed statements. Okay, I retract the word ignorant, but uninformed statements outside of this chamber.
Senator, so again, as much as you have retracted the statement, just be mindful that making the statement and then retracting it in the manner in which you just did is just as bad. Try your very best not to make the statement in the first place. Continue.
I apologize. So one would not want the minister, the Honorable Minister, nor any member of the government to repeat those wholly erroneous statements outside of the Parliament. We would not want the media who are present, well, at least on camera with us, to repeat such erroneous statements as headlines. Because the first issue is the $31 billion, you have to discount all matters that arose regarding CLICO. Because that was a creature of the government under Patrick Manning, a PNM administration, of which several members present on the government benches were part of. There's another issue, Mr. Vice President, before you even address the remaining $11 billion, was the now historical record of Petrotrin, the World Gas Liquids issue, the Ken Julian board's misstep in being hoodwinked by, in the words of the Minister of Finance, carpetbaggers, straddling the taxpayer via Petrotrin with a debt in excess of 85 for one bond alone, because there were two, 85 million US per annum in interest. Because it was interest payments and a bullet payment due, which was due August last year. 85 million US every year for 5 years. Now, that carries you to a situation where you have billions to pay. When you add the interest and the principal from the blended payment of the other bond, of at least 5 billion TT dollars over that 5-year period. So you add 20 to 5, so you get 25. You only have $6 billion left. So if, on sober reflection, the people of Trinidad and Tobago recognize that the People's Partnership Government only increased from their doing by $6 billion, the debt net of sterilization purposes for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, then only a responsible government minister will come here and accept that all that they were responsible for was that $6 billion. Because, Mr. Vice President, only an irresponsible individual will say on their behalf there was a $5 billion that they was straddled with to settle salary negotiations from the last government, but accrue to that same government $25 billion arising from the Clico debacle and the Petrotrin scandal of Ken Julian's doing. So that $25 billion, that is P&M $25 billion. Understand? We, the rest of the people of Trinidad and Tobago, will take the $6 billion. But P&M must claim and own that $25 billion. And let this be the last day that we have to hear from a government minister, especially one who should know better on matters of finance, talking about $31 billion. So, Mr. Vice President, and it gets worse than that. It gets worse than that. Because when you consider that they also were beneficiaries of a Heritage and Stabilization Fund, of foreign exchange reserves, which I will go into in a little more detail as I deal with the issues regarding this bill, because this bill is really and truly speaking to one purpose. What is the purpose for which we are called to Parliament today? To approve, in essence, transfer from one ministry to another ministry on account of public utilities, so-called savings, I would call it deferral of payments that were due, to a Ministry of Finance requirement to settle issues regarding interest charges on the overdraft facility. You have an exchequer account that is in excess of $40 billion. And this account has been overdrawn since 2003. So it's across administrations. From 2003 to now, this is the fourth government in place since 2003. So, Mr. Vice President, debt management is something that we've been managing in this country for quite some time. And unfortunately, there's another issue that I have to correct the record with. Because the Honorable Minister and the Ministry of Finance, in piloting this bill today, because I listened attentively to see whether or not the statements of the Minister of Finance would be echoed in this chamber. But unfortunately, it has found its way here through the piloting of this bill, as has the contribution of the Minister of Public Utilities. The Minister and the Ministry of Finance made mention of the $318 million that was paid regarding the foreign exchange interest rate swaps. But the minister, in making that statement, supported the Minister of Finance, because the Minister of Finance made a statement regarding the gambling, saying that the last Minister of Finance gambled on these interest rate swaps in an attempt that one can only presume was to appeal to persons, and I'm not going to use the word ignorant, but persons who are not familiar with finance. All right? Because my use of the word before was not to demean anyone, but it was mainly based on the pure purpose and meaning of the word. So persons who are not informed, Mr. Vice President, is the word I will use, on matters of finance. Because you have, the last government took two swaps. One had to do with the Chinese trading, and the other with the US. And because the Honorable Minister, both Ministers of Finance, Mr. Vice President, have put that to the public I am now tasked, we here in the opposition are now tasked to explain to the people of Trinidad and Tobago what were the purposes of those things in the first place, in light of the fact that this bill deals with matters that arose regarding the debt position on a cash basis of the government. And I'll try to be as simplistic as possible. You see, during 2010 to 15, there was a primary concern regarding the Chinese currency. The concern was that the currency was likely to appreciate. All right, China is emerging as a world power. They had at that time experienced over 2 decades of continuous growth annually. And it was expected or anticipated that there could be the potential for their dollar to increase relative to the currencies of our trading partners, which amounts to an appreciation. And of course, we don't have earnings in Chinese yuan. Therefore, you'll have to, for use of a non-financial term, pass it through the US system. So basically, we have to buy the US to get yuan. Until and unless you have a direct foreign exchange policy with the government of China via the central bank, you have to purchase US to obtain yuan. So that was the general consensus. That is the Chinese component. If the Chinese yuan appreciates, you need to have a way to hedge against that. It is very interesting, Mr. Vice President, that the Minister of Finance, none of the 2 ministers made any mention of that situation, whether or not it's warranted at this time, whether or not they're pursuing it. They simply chose to mention the explanation for a payment and for getting out of the US situation. But a swap position has nothing to do with gambling, Mr. Vice President. A hedge on interest rates has nothing to do with gambling per se. It may appear like gambling, but so too does a horse and a mule. They may appear similar, but they aren't the same. It may appear like gambling. However, what it actually is, it is a form of mitigating against risk. So what you are doing is you are expecting there to be a significant increase in something that can negatively affect how much money you have to pay. So what you do is you hedge against it. They would use you would bet against to make it simple, but it's not a bet necessarily. What it is you are protecting your position. So if you lose on one end, you don't lose your shirt. The issue now had to do with the US exchange rate, the rates for bonds did not significantly increase. In fact, they started to decline. But up until 2017, 2018, there was ample opportunity, Mr. Vice President, for the Minister of Finance to unwind that situation. There was ample opportunity. But they waited, or the Minister of Finance waited. Did the Minister of Finance get advice from senior officials at the ministry? Did the Minister of Finance, to the contrary, about waiting? Did the Minister of Finance get advice from the central bank to the contrary about waiting? Did the Minister of Finance seek advice? These are 3 questions that one must ask. And if the Minister of Finance was found to have obtained advice, then there is one conclusion that we must come to, that the Minister of Finance can be suspicious of neglect. However, if the minister didn't seek any advice, it may mean that the minister is not even aware of the duties and responsibilities of a Minister of Finance in managing our debt situation. Because a Minister of Finance must be the master of what he surveys, which is the entire portfolio of debt instruments that are available to him as a minister. And if, of course, the minister waited 4 years and $318 million after, and did not act before when it may have been more affordable to act. You would have had to pay, but it may not have had to pay as much. Then it stands to reason that the Minister of Finance was derelict in his duty and should not seek to put blame where blame doesn't lie. The blame falls squarely with this government and this Minister of Finance. Because, Mr. Vice President, interest rate risks and so on, those are things that are not static environments. And I wouldn't spend too much time again on this specific point. But they are not static environments. It's akin to, and the whole concept of it, I'll end on this part of my presentation on this point, is akin to buying insurance. Okay? So the government has considerable flexibility as far as swaps are concerned and can unwind as they see fit. But, Mr. Vice President, if one spends $5,000 per annum on insurance for the house, and after 20 years, you've spent $100,000 on insurance, did you waste that money? Was that a loss? Or was that prudent management of your financial resources so that if your house burnt down, you can get back the $3 million or the $2 million or the $1 million that it was worth? Now, if you consider that if the house burns down, you will lose $1 million, then the $100,000 was a good investment. The question was, did this government monitor the situation that prevailed after 2015? Because they can't ask a Minister of Finance to come and, who was Minister up to 2015 September, to come and help them manage their affairs, unless, of course, they wanted to pay him, you know? So the reality is, as they have found it fit to pay Winston Gypsy Peters and Gary Griffith, because all the talent is on this side, Mr. Vice President. So, Mr. Vice President, the Minister of Finance's assertion, and echoed by the Minister as well today, Honorable Allyson West, basically they are saying that they don't understand the point of insuring or hedging your position. And it cannot mean that they truly agree with what they are saying. It probably meant that no advice was sought. And I need not remind this Honorable House that under this very government, they dismantled and fired all the advisors when they collapsed the Economic Development Advisory Board over a year ago. So, Mr. Vice President, there were some other points that were made, and I want to turn to one specific point on the bill, because the bill looks at head of expenditure 39 and a $255 million issue regarding the ministry, of which a significant part has to do with WASA and arrears on a particular loan of $56 million, at least from the Minister of Finance's statement. And it begs the question, Mr. Vice President, because when one looks at the Auditor General's report of the letters of credit and the loans and guarantees of the government to state agencies, you see a number of loans to WASA. It begs the question, specifically, what exactly was in arrears? How current would WASA be on this particular facility, or is WASA also not current on other facilities? Because WASA, whilst WASA may not necessarily be an institution that can suffer reputational loss when it's looking for financing, because it depends on the full fate of the Treasury of Trinidad and Tobago, it begs a broader question. What of the other state agencies that are managed by the state? All right? So, I want to promise to the people of Trinidad and Tobago that we will be further interrogating this question of arrears of state enterprises as the session continues. Now, Mr. Vice President, the Minister of Finance also, in piloting, placed as a justification for this challenge with the overdraft facility, and thus this transfer to the Ministry of Finance, as the lower than projected revenue from taxes and specifically from energy sectors, the energy sector. My apologies. Looming large in the presentation of the Minister of Finance, looming large in the presentation of the Minister and the Ministry of Finance as well, was the fact that Petrotrin was closed down under their term in office. And as a result of that, a large number of companies that are involved in the refinery operations have also realized a significant decline in their earnings. There are many contractors who would tell you 40%, 60% hardware owners and persons who provide a large part of their business to the energy sector through Petrotrin, through the refinery, lost significant parts of their business. So when this government, ill-advised as it was, closed down Petrotrin, shut the refinery, what they did in one blow, Mr. Vice President, was to act as a death knell to the very taxes that the taxpayer depends on, the very taxes that the citizen depends on for healthcare, the very taxes that the citizen depends on for education. And therefore, it comes as no surprise if I were to reference one note, Mr. Vice President, one note from the 10 pages of notes that was given to us at this time, that they have starved the Trinidad and Tobago Hospitality and Tourism Institute of $1.27 million in funding. $1.27 million in funding, saying that private companies giving them money, so they don't need government funds anymore. Which has resulted in, from this one note that I'm referencing, Mr. Vice President, which has resulted in over 200 students in Trinidad and Tobago being denied access to tertiary level education. This government should be ashamed of themselves. This is a dastardly act that, of course, is connected directly to the closure of Petrotrin. Now, Mr. Vice President, the Minister of Finance dedicated at least 10% of her time speaking to some of these transfers merely to give a picture of the impact of it. So I want to give a picture of the impact of those transfers. Just about 2 minutes I would take on that, with your guidance, of course. Because there are two areas, when you look at these transfers, that in particular to where the Ministry of Finance is concerned, and the Ministry of Education, that negatively affects the welfare and the well-being of the citizens of this country. And one has to do the households. Because when you take away $23.7 million from the Children's Life Fund, $32 million from the Food Price Support Program, $12 million from VSEP for the Central Tenders Board, Mr. Vice President, $25 million from ADB, $120 million from the Trinidad and Tobago Mortgage Finance Company, $26.1 million from the Tourism Development Company, $20 million from the Farmers Incentive Program, to the $7.8 million from the Business Stimulus Program,
Okay,
and
Senator,
$50 million.
1 second. As much as there was some talk in the debate thus far in relation to transfers, what it is that the Senate document that was circulated is not for debate. It's for information purposes mainly. What is for debate is the bill that's in front of us, which speaks to the transfer from the Ministry of Public Utilities to the Ministry of Finance. So when you dive into the Senate document, that particular part of it is not allowed. If you are generally dealing with idea of transfers has been raised in the debate thus far, that's fine. But going deeply into the Senate document, that part is not allowed. We are dealing with the bill that is in front of us. Continue.
The Minister of Finance made reference to specific actual transfers. And so what I'm doing is, and try to paint a picture of prudent financial management. But I am showing how imprudent it was. So basically what I am doing is, the last one I will just put is CDB and the Caribbean Development Fund, COSTAT 8 million, and NESC 6.5 million. What that shows you is this: the energy sector, via their approach to these transfers, they've robbed the energy sector of in excess of $40 million. Via this, they've robbed the home construction and the home mortgage market of over $200 million. Via this, they've taken money directly, Mr. Vice President, from the food, from the tables of people. They've taken food from the mouths of babes and suckling by taking money away from the Children's Life Fund and the Food Price Support Program. This bill, Mr. Vice President, and the supporting notes is showing where the priority for prudent management lies in this government. It does not lie with the households, the children, the business, the small business to medium business sector, education sector, energy skills acquisition sector, the tourism and hospitality training sector. So all the areas where the citizens of this country, Mr. Vice President, can benefit, they have been denied. And that is why I said at the beginning that finance credentials does not necessarily mean good political credentials. Because what matters to the people is not simply that the books balance. Books always balance. Accounting books always balance. Whether it balances with borrowings or with surpluses, deficits or surpluses, is a matter for the accountant. But what is important to the citizens of the country is the future and welfare and well-being of their family, themselves, their community, and the nation. And by simply coming to ask for an increase in the overdraft facility, Mr. Vice President, what I'm saying is in a nutshell is this. If we were coming here to this House to talk about an increase in the overdraft facility, but they maintain the money for ADB, so farmers can get money, but they maintain the money for just 1.2 million they couldn't give, Mr. Vice President, that is wickedness to hospitality and tourism students. If they had maintained that, the 6 million for NESC, if they had maintained that so that students can acquire energy skills. Because they closed down in Point 14, Moruga, and Palo Seco, the energy skills centers. The point I'm making is, if by this debate and the supporting notes to the bill, we were seeing that they had to borrow to keep education running in this country. They had to borrow to keep medicines available in the hospital. They had to borrow to keep farmers engaged. They had to borrow because they needed to spend that $50 million on the public-private housing construction program to give people shelter in this country. We would have been happy to participate in this debate. But what they are doing is, we are coming here to say that, well, they ran over the overdraft, Mr. Vice President, and then you are hearing that one senior government official, after 5 years, would have benefited over $100 million in rent. That angers the citizens of this country. That angers the citizens of this country. So if the citizens were hearing, we come here to give them $1 billion, yes. We're fighting for them to get resources. But we're fighting to transfer this money so that one senior government official can get $100 million after 5 years in rent. Because that is what it amounts to. That is what this entire process amounts to, unfortunately. Mr. Vice President, I want to turn to the the bountiful harvest that this government received from the People's Partnership Government in the form of the Heritage and Stabilization Fund. Because it is because of that Heritage and Stabilization Fund, Mr. Vice President, that we are speaking of $250 million today, and not possibly $1 billion in overdraft interest and other charges. The HSF, 8 billion TT dollars was added, TT equivalent, was added to the Heritage and Stabilization Fund from 2010 to 2015. The HSF itself grew by 17.77 billion Trinidad and Tobago dollars, 2.62 billion US dollars over that period. Of course, the source would be the quarterly report of the HSF, produced by the Ministry of Finance. Under this government, Mr. Vice President, from 2 drawings only, half of the money, more than half of the money that was deposited in the HSF by the People's Partnership Government was withdrawn, $4.26 billion. $4.26 billion. Now, if they had even taken out $8 billion, but by doing that you kept children in hotel school, by doing that you kept medicine in the hospital, we would say, okay, if by taking out even $8 billion, thank you, Mr. Vice President, it would have resulted in our school children having laptops in their book bags, Mr. Vice President, internet, Wi-Fi, internet at school, we would have said, okay. But you take away $4 billion, but you're still cutting back money from school children. You're still cutting back money from skills acquisition centers in NESC and hotel school and so on. Mr. Vice President, it is reprehensible in the least that we must come here and examine the skewed priorities of this government. But we must. Mr. Vice President, I want to turn to the specifics of the TNTech facility, credit facility. Now, the Trinidad and Tobago Electricity Commission has a facility with Republic Bank. 250 plus million US. And this loan straddles 2 governments. All right? It started off as a letter of credit. This is one of the primary credit facilities that forms the basis of this bill. It started off as a letter of credit in the fiscal year 2015, and which was the final year of the People's Partnership Government in the form of a bridging loan. But the deed of guarantee was only effected in May 2018. All right? Now, there's an issue where that is concerned. Because one would have hoped, Mr. Vice President, that the government would have given a little more detail as to what is the balance due on the facility, what would have been the rate of interest and so on, the conditions of the facility, so that by giving us the information, we could come to our own full appreciation of what were the circumstances that resulted in $1 million less being paid on this facility. Because one way in which you can reduce the amount of principal that you pay on a facility, Mr. Vice President, is to increase the amount of payments you make per year. So for instance, if it was a semi-annual payment, so you pay one every 6 months, and then you're paying it now every quarter, you would pay less principal payments and so on. The issue now would be what exactly was the mechanisms of it. It's good sometimes for full disclosure. It may seem pedantic, but it's good sometimes for full disclosure to have an absence of doubt so that we can understand. Because you would shudder to believe that the reason for less payments of principal was because you missed a payment. You don't want speculation to creep in. You want to be sure that it's really just from a refinancing of the existing facility. All right? So, Mr. Vice President, I want to close where I began. The overdraft facility, the exchequer is at $40 billion. Through this presentation today and yesterday, the government made no clear direction as to how they will address any aspect of the exchequer account being negatively overdrawn. The $31 billion is a fiction of the PNM's imagination, because $25 billion of that was created from CLICO, which is $20 billion, and Petrotrin through the Ken Julian failings regarding WGTL. So there's only $6 billion that they could pin on the People's Partnership government. The rest using the words of their political leader. The other $25 billion must bolt to their chest as their responsibility for their failings in office. And I thank you, Mr. Vice President.
Senator Haynes.
Thank you, Mr. Vice President, for the opportunity to intervene on this finance variation of appropriation bill as we close off the financial year 2019. And Mr. Vice President, I want to start off with a reflection on our budgetary process and the reason it is designed the way that it is. It is meant to be a time when you look at the appropriation bill for the government to account to the population for how they intend to spend our money and how they would have spent our money in the previous fiscal year. And government accountability on how they utilize our finances is a critical element of our democracy and one that ought not to be trifled with at all. Mr. Vice President, we are told via the bill that a sum was reduced from the Ministry of Public Utilities, $200+ million, and the Ministry of Finance was the beneficiary of the increase, so we're varying the appropriation. And I took very careful note of your guidance regarding the transfers, that they ought to be mentioned but not debated, which I understand and I acknowledge. The minister in the Ministry of Finance, as she opened the debate today, stated, which was much to my delight, that the money was reprioritized. So the transfers were approved and they reflected the reordering of priorities by the ministry, as the words of the Minister of Finance as we began the debate this afternoon. So I looked through the document before us, and not in all occasions was it in fact a reordering of priorities. In some instances, and if you will allow me very briefly to mention two of those instances, it's just blatant incompetence. It was not a reordering of priorities at all. If you look to the private public housing construction incentive program, the $50 million that was allocated, was not spent because there was a failure to develop policy guidelines so that the program could not be implemented. That is not a reordering of any priority. That is a failure to implement a project that you promised. And the failure is because you could not, in a year, develop policy guidelines. So it wasn't anything else, it's that you could not develop policy guidelines to implement a project. Similarly, if you look at the IDF, the money programs just could not be implemented. No reason why, they just could not do it. And so when we say, Mr. Vice President, Madam President, that this is a government of announcements and no implementation, their own document proves us to be very correct. And as we look through, and my concern from the beginning, when I looked at the document, was what was going on at the Ministry of Finance. Because thank you. Welcome back, Madam President. So, when you look at the Ministry of Finance, which is the beneficiary of the increase as per the bill before us, there is a very interesting reason for transfer, which is to effect the payment to a certain lobby group in Washington, D.C. Now, Madam President, in a very exuberant presentation by the Minister of Public Utilities, who I think 2020 has given him some new energy to talk about all things except his portfolio, he raised the point today that why are we so concerned about $6 million to a lobbying firm in D.C.? What is the question of the lobbyist firm? Why are we raising this question of the $6 million? So, Madam President, I'm going to use my time today, and I don't intend to detain the Senate for very long, but I'm going to explain to the Minister of Public Utilities, and again, very focused on the Ministry of Finance, which is the beneficiary of the increase in the bill that is before us, why we have some concerns about your particular use of the lobby firms. Now, I think my colleagues who went before me did very well to detail what our interests were in various areas. And Senator Mark did in fact raise the lobby firm, but the legality of the contract, etc. Those of us who have any experience in the United States and with the US system of government understands what is the purpose and the role of a lobbying firm. It is unusual for a country to use a lobbying firm, simply because firms are used to exert influence on elected members of Congress, elected members of the US system of government. Whereas if you are a nation, a country like Trinidad and Tobago, you, I think, are expected to use your foreign affairs apparatus, your embassies, etc. And presumably we have a Minister of Foreign Affairs, and there's certain work that can be done via the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. And therefore, the question comes to us, what is the role of this lobbying firm to the tune of the $6 million and the increase that the Ministry of Finance would have needed? Now, this is not the first mention we have of this lobbying firm. They would have been in the news since 2016, 2017, etc. And these are my questions, Madam President. If you look, so each firm has to register with the DOJ, the US Department of Justice, pursuant to their Foreign Agents Registration Act of 1938. They have to register what is the work they're doing. If you look at the website of the group mentioned in the document, the group that is going to receive this money and has been receiving money from the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago since 2016, Trinidad and Tobago is the only country listed as a client. All other clients are companies and corporations who would need lobbying for whatever reason, but Trinidad and Tobago is the only country that's listed here. Prior to this, the same firm was engaged by Bermuda at a fraction of the cost, Madam President, at a fraction of the cost at which Trinidad and Tobago retained the exact same firm. But here's why we have questions, and this is very specific for the Minister of Public Utilities, as why we're raising the questions. The lobby, well, I will get to the issues that you're dealing with, because I have it registered by the company would be all of the things that they would have done for Trinidad and Tobago. Because the accountability, there's a private company and they have to account once you're dealing with a country, and they have to account for what types of lobbying they are doing. But
what with the relevance of this line of
Senator Ameen, thank you. But may I please? Yes. Senator Haynes, you're spending a lot of time. I know that you are responding, but your response needs to be a little more succinct because you need to get to what is the matter at hand. Okay?
Thank you, Madam President. It's really, I am using that much time to explain the details of it so that people would not get lost in the system, because it's a different system than what we're accustomed to. So I can go through this a little bit quicker for you. In 2019, and I have no problem putting the documents in the public, the firm would have listed out what was the work done for Trinidad and Tobago. There were 4 meetings. 4 meetings with Democratic members of the Congress and the Senate in the United States. If anybody paying attention to global politics now, Madam President, understands that in the United States, there's a Republican president, a Republican Senate, and as of 2019, which would be 3 years on from when this firm was hired by the government of the Republic of Trinidad and Tobago, presumably, that you would have had a Republican Congress as of 2019. Prior to that, it was, a Democratic Congress as of 2019. There would have been a Republican.
Senator Haynes, you're really now losing me. I am trying to, understand where you're going, but I think you need to get to the point. I think everyone here understands the history and the dynamics of politics elsewhere. So can you get to the point, please?
Absolutely. The firm that is hired is a Democratic lobbying firm. So who are we paying $6 million to lobby? Who are you paying? And why aren't you using the embassies in Washington, D.C. to set up these meetings as opposed to using a lobbying firm? Madam President, if you look at the fees that are ordinarily charged by this said same lobbying firm, what is being paid out by Trinidad and Tobago is a windfall. They don't make that much money doing the work that they do. So how is it? And these are the questions that I will ask very pointedly to the Minister of Finance, because as I said, this money is allocated to the Ministry of Finance. In the bill before us, the increase is for the Ministry of Finance, and that's where we're going with this. What was the procurement process to get to this particular lobbying firm? As a country, Trinidad and Tobago needed to look overall at the political landscape, and if you had to use a lobbying firm, and I do not accept that we needed a lobbying firm, you needed to pick one that can lobby the majority of the United States government, which at this time is Republican and not Democrat. And is it that the government, as they are now, is in some way hedging over personalities that they may like to meet, as opposed to putting our foreign relations interests at the top of the priority? Madam President, when you look at the reporting from the group DC LLC, there was only 1 trip to Trinidad and Tobago in 2019. They listed that here. If you look at the website, the key elements of the group, they're not really
Point of order. Point of order, 46-1.
Senator Haynes, I'm going to give you one last chance to just wrap up on this point, please, and make other points as you go along.
No, absolutely, Madam President. And it's very interesting that it is a former Minister of Foreign Affairs who knows who did not engage a lobbying firm as the Minister of Foreign Affairs, but used the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to do this kind of work. That will not find that is finding fault with the argument now. But the $6 million, they like the Democrats.
Please let us not go down that path. Okay, Senator Hussain? Senator Haynes, continue.
Thank you, Madam President. And, but it is important, Madam President, when accounting to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, to tell us why you needed the $6 million. It may not seem like a lot to them, but it seems like a lot to the people who have lost the food cards. And when you are thinking about lobbying firms, are we getting value for money from this money that is being spent? Or is it, Madam President, the fact that this firm's priority is in fact in political consultations and political strategy, political communications, as opposed to being a lobbying firm? So they have a lot of questions to answer about why they engaged this particular firm. They have engaged this firm since 2016. You are seeing money being meted out again. Senator Mark raised certain questions. But I think the onus is on the government to explain to the people of Trinidad and Tobago where is the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in our foreign policy, and why are we engaging a lobbying firm to do the work of the ministry. And I thank you.
Senator Ameen.
Thank you very much, Madam President. I want to thank you for this opportunity. I expected to wrap up the debate on the opposition bench, but I really didn't expect it to be so early. And unfortunately, it's because the government does not seem to be in a position to defend itself, and this transfer of monies and this appropriation bill that is before the Senate. They have done a poor job of debating today. And I believe, Madam President, it is because they themselves are unconvinced of their own narrative, of their own stories. Madam President, I listened to the lackluster debate on the other side, and it reminds me of a little story of African origin. And it says that when a cow gives milk, the whole village could feed from it. But the cow does not make much noise, doesn't make any noise. But when a hen lays an egg, it lays just one egg. And that egg could barely feed one child. But it crows, and the chicken, the fowl, crows and makes a lot of noise for the whole village to hear, and for the whole village to know that it laid an egg. But if you grow up in the countryside like I did, you know as well, in addition to the hens that lay eggs, you have what you call a barren hen. A hen that is unable to lay an egg, but it would sit on the egg of another hen, or on no egg at all, and make all the noise as if it has laid an egg. And the PNM reminds me today of that barren hen. All noise, all talk, no performance, zero performance. Madam President, the bulk of these transfers are because of the PNM's failure to implement what it promised to the people of Trinidad and Tobago. In a number of key areas, I am very concerned. There are two categories for their reasons, in fact, what they call savings, Madam President, that really fall into two categories. One is incompetence, and one has to be, guide me, Madam President, if it is parliamentary to say wickedness. Because when you have a reduction in the number of people meeting the criteria for food cards because they changed the criteria to cause them to save, in inverted commas, save $32 million, it means that there's $32 million less going to feed poor, hungry people in Trinidad and Tobago. That is their achievement. When this government is allowing people to die, young children to die, because they are suppressing funds from being spent in the Children's Life Fund, to come and beat their chest and say they saved $23,700,000. That has to be wickedness. When one of their achievements is saving money because they failed to relocate and regularize squatters, that is neglect for the social needs of the people of Trinidad and Tobago. And that, Madam President, seems to be a common thread in almost every area that the government claim they have a savings. It is not a savings if the government makes a promise in their manifesto in 2015, makes a promise in their subsequent budget, and then fails to deliver on those promises because there was failure to conduct a survey. There was failure to get cabinet approval. How much money cabinet approval costing you? You're talking about saving and suppressing funds. You have a delay in recruitment for key programs that the government promised. We talk about crime fighting as a major issue, yet you can see in national security, Madam President, in the prison service, there's a delay in recruiting. In a number of ministries, there's this delay in recruiting.
Senator Ameen, you're 5 minutes into your contribution, and I have to caution you the way I've been cautioning other speakers. What is before us? There is information that has been circulated by the Ministry of Finance for information, talking about transfers within ministries. The bill that is before us is dealing with transfers from one ministry to another. So you can't spend, I will ask you not to spend all your time talking about the document that was circulated for the information of members.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, there is an area of concern that I have, and with your permission, I want to take this opportunity to plead with the government. I know they don't have much time in this term, but Madam President, if you would allow me, this is a matter I've spoken about before, where the government's priority is with regards to crime fighting, the link with unemployment and opportunities for young people and education. These are areas, Madam President, that I have seen a significant imbalance in the government's priority in spending. In a number of instances, there are matters that are easy to calculate. So that I will use an example out of the air. If you have schools where teachers receive salaries, you know the number of teachers in the schools. You know they have 12 months' salaries to get for the year. You can easily calculate the amount of money you will need to pay the salaries. But if, Madam President, you are having a significant deficiency, it has to be poor planning. Schools are critical in the life of our young people. And I have seen a pattern where schools and education facilities seem to be poorly budgeted for. This matter I spoke about when we had the budget debate, and it seems to be continuing. And I want to take the opportunity to plead with the government. I know the Minister of Education is not here, but I am sure that the ministers also follow the debate. And the opposition did point out that the government had significantly under-budgeted for key areas such as security in schools, teachers' salaries, school feeding program, and so on. Now the government is in a position where they have to take monies from other areas to supplement those votes. And I think that is poor planning. I am concerned, Madam President, about the technical and vocational areas that would occupy young people and provide opportunities for them. And there are a number of government-funded programs and activities that have been reprioritized in this bill. The establishment of hype centers in Diego Martin, Rima, Pointe-à-Pitre, and Madeline, Laventille, a number of these technical and vocational centers have been shelved. And that, I feel, is a tragedy that will cost us more in the long run because of the denial of opportunities to our young people. And because we are in a situation where we are speaking of saving our young people from the scourge of crime, from social neglect and social decay. We are in a situation, Madam President, where unemployment is one of the hot topics in this country. After crime, anywhere you go and you meet people and they have a personal concern that they want to share with you, in many cases it is unemployment. And you know, sadly, in many of the constituencies represented by the PNM, the youth are crying out because of lack of employment and lack of opportunities by this government. And yet, we have the government in a critical ministry such as the Ministry of Labor, doing what you call reprioritizing, but essentially it means that Minister of Labor and Small Enterprises, on the next opportunity to report to this Parliament and anywhere in the public domain, will have to say that the things she and her ministry laid out in the budget, the things that they promised in the manifesto, they could not achieve. They could not do the determination of the impact of the minimum wage level on the economy, which is a study that would inform the government on whether to increase the minimum wage or not. The government did increase the minimum wage, and many people who receive minimum wage are happy about that. But here now, I am wondering on what basis. If the minister was unable to conduct this study to advise the government, did they just do it on VAPs? Did they just come to Parliament to put that in the budget as a form of mamagai to the people of Trinidad and Tobago, because they know that an election is due in 2020? But there are a number of other key matters that fall within this ministry that I feel will have a negative impact on this country's ability to create employment and to create meaningful employment based on data. The development of a modernized labor market information system, cooperative development and strengthening program, the development of a child labor policy, and there are much more. But I'm sorry, I know the Minister of Labor and Small Enterprises speaks very passionately about these things. I'm disappointed that that minister was not able to contribute today. But then I could imagine the disappointment she herself must feel to have to come to say, we could not deliver these things. We could not deliver these key things to improve employment in Trinidad and Tobago. Again, a failure for the government. And it is listed as reasons for savings. That is their explanation. Another minister I would have liked to hear from today is the Minister of Local Government. You know my passion is in local government.
Senator Ameen, please, I would ask you to please take my guidance, my advice on how to proceed with your presentation, okay? But you're just veering off and you're not dealing with the matter at hand, okay?
Madam President, I'm so sorry that you put a pause at me and I was going to talk about local government, because as I said, that's an area of passion. I served in local government for 10 years. Madam President, the concern is the government's priority that has brought us to this bill. The concern is, I am not going into the details of the document that was sent us to explain. What I am pointing out is the government's priority and the principles that they seem to adopt that would lead to the changes that are made in this appropriation bill. Madam President, so while the appropriation bill itself would speak about, a particular head in Ministry of Finance and Ministry of Public Utilities, I am hoping, Madam President, that the principles that allow the government to make this decision could be examined by the nation during this debate. Madam President, because you stopped me, I'll have to spare the Minister of Local Government today. But I just want to say for the record that I am disappointed that a number of key promises in local government are yet to be implemented. It has been a lot of mamagayan talk, but you are seeing a lot of deficiencies and inefficiencies. And I don't know who runs in the ministry, but Madam President, when I hear the Minister of Local Government talk, he sounds so willing and so genuine, and then you hear no money, no funds. And at the end of the day, you see a savings because the government has a principle of suppression of funds, where the Ministry of Finance fails to release funding for critical items across the board in all ministries, deprive state agencies and ministries of monies to do what they are supposed to do, and then report it as a savings. And I question, Madam President, when in the last financial year, I saw councillors evicted from their offices because they couldn't pay rent. I saw a number of corporations faced with tremendous flooding, and they didn't have the funding to deal with it. And then I see savings in the Ministry of Local Government. Madam President, what I think the government is doing in this bill, in a number of instances, is kicking the can down the road. They are kicking the can down the road for somebody else to deal with it. And a classic example is in the Ministry of Public Utilities. The Minister of Public Utilities stood up here and he spoke with such vigor. Madam President, in his ministry, and in fact that is in the bill under the Public Utilities head, one of the reasons for saving is because the government had allocated money to do certain things in Wassa, and then they took a loan to do that same thing, and they consider that a saving. What you have essentially done, when you take a loan, you have to pay it back. You're kicking the can down the road for somebody else to deal with it. You're suppressing funding and calling that savings. I hear this minister speak. I don't know who he's shouting at. He came here in a quarreling mood. And one of the things that I found significant about his contribution was that he was speaking as though he was complaining about the ills in Wassa that prevents efficient water distribution in this country, about the ills in Tientec. You are coming here after 4.5 years to complain to us. You are in government, you are in charge, and you have failed to deliver on water and lights in this country. But you come here and you're outlining all the problems. For who to fix? The opposition? The opposition will be fixing it shortly, Madam President, because very soon we will be on that side and they will be on this side. Madam President, one of the things I want to also mention in response to the Minister of Public Utilities, he spoke very briefly and he said, you put in the infrastructure for sports tourism. And he was speaking in a dismissive manner about the People's Partnership's achievements in sporting infrastructure in this country that would lead to sporting tourism. And in so doing, he is actually acknowledging the fact that the infrastructure put in by the People's Partnership would lead to successful income-generating activities in sports tourism. And that includes the tennis center at Taharqa, the National Aquatic Center, and the National Cycling Center in Couva. And you know, Madam President, this weekend, I attended the National Secondary School swim meet at the National Aquatic Center, which is a state-of-the-art facility, Olympic-sized pool. And there are issues at that facility already, to the extent where, you know, the children are swimming in ice-cold water because it seems as though the warmer is down. And this is a new facility. And because of, I suppose, poor management or poor maintenance.
Senator Ameen.
Yes.
I really have to, please, I'm asking you that this be the last time that I have to say this to you, but you need, I think, to wrap up your contribution now because you're no longer speaking on the bill at all, okay?
Thank you, Madam President. As I said, I was responding to the Minister.
Please, I know what you said. I've been listening attentively, but I have to tell you that you're way beyond responding to whatever the Minister said, and now you're completely on a frolic of your own and not dealing with the matter at hand. Please.
Okay, Madam President, I will stop there. I was raised the matter to ask the Minister of Public Utilities that he cannot have this attitude towards sports and sports tourism and want to be part of a government. If you are part of a government, you have to care for the needs and the interests of the people. And that remark made by that minister is not deserving to have a remark to be made to the people of this country. So, Madam President, there is, because of the way the bill is framed, Madam President, and because of the restrictions that may be considered in terms of what is relevant to the bill, there might be restrictions on the debate. But this is an opportunity for the people of Trinidad and Tobago to re-examine the spending priorities of this government. It's about things that look pretty and look good, but the things that are meaningful to the lives of the people of this country, where it comes to the moral fabric, the social fabric of this country, reaching those who are most in need, the government is falling down, and they are neglecting it. And Madam President, I don't think this government could last our next budget, so this may very well be the last time we have a discussion on government finance bill, but I think the government has had enough time to prove itself, and it has failed miserably. Thank you, Madam President.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you very much. Madam President. Madam President, I join this debate to make an extremely short intervention, and I accentuate the word extremely short. For several reasons. Short because my voice still is giving me some problems. And secondly, I just want to make sure my knock's still in terms of debating. But having said that, Madam President, Madam President, today is the 28th of January, 2020. It's nice to be back at the Red House. I had the honor to serve here with the other chamber from 2002 to 2007. And today is indeed a historic day for the people of Trinidad and Tobago, for the members of Parliament, both from the House of Representatives and from the Senate. But January 1st, 2020, everybody forgets. The vision of this country in 2002, 2003 was to make Trinidad and Tobago a developed country by the year 2020. And it was the mantra that was sung and practiced by the Manning administration of the People's National Movement. We were well on a trajectory to make significant parts of that happen. Because you don't get up one morning and you're a developed country, but there's a progression, and we were along the right path. Because I make the statement in this appropriation discussion, because this is the last act, so to speak, of the 2019 budget. Because every budget must be put into a policy framework. For those of you, and I know my senators at the end of the bench there, remember the days of the 5-year development plans? The days of Frank Bassotti and Frank Rampasad and all these illustrious permanent secretaries in the Ministry of Finance. Under the stewardship of Dr. Williams, there was a 5-year development plan, and the budget was part of that process as we moved into that scenario. The Chinese are still doing it today, you know, with 5-year development plans. And look where the economy is. But then came the articulated vision of a PNM political leader to say, let's take a quantum leap. Let's set a vision for this country so that we can differentiate ourselves in our space. It had a widespread discussion. Dr. Botiwari was on the committee, you know, the member of parliament for County Central now. The chairman was Atta Lockjack, an illustrious businessman. There were scores and scores of scholars and practitioners in every aspect of the economic life of Trinidad and Tobago on that committee. We prepared documents, and we started to roll out the plan. Oil prices were high, gas prices were high. And, so to speak, things were going fairly smoothly. Whatever happened in 2010 politically happened. But for those of you who have heard me speak, I always talk about continuity of policy. The 3 areas that I always say must have continuity is foreign affairs, energy, and national security. There's very little room to maneuver there, because the policies that this administration puts in energy has to be continued, because you deal with big multinationals. The policy that you articulate in foreign affairs has to have continuity. And the policies that you put in place for crime and criminality has to be continued. The point I want to put on the record, I've made it earlier in this term, but I want to put it on the record again. Something fundamentally went wrong in the year 2010 to 2015. I shared this story, I think, in 2016 or sometime. I'm not sure if some of the newer independents heard it. But in 2011, I was chairman of the PNM at the time. I got a call from a senior public servant in the Ministry of Planning and Development. It was called Planning and Sustainable Development. He said, Mr. Khan, I want to tell you that we have been instructed to dump all the documents of Vision 2020. A UNC administration, such a profound and robust document. If you wanted to tweak it, tweak it. If you wanted to dispense part of it, do that. But they were instructed to dump the entire portfolio for Vision 2020. I had a Toyota Hilux pickup at the time. They say, come down now and collect it before it goes to the Labas and Bitam. I was in Balize House. I got one of the helpers here to come with me. We went down into the basement of the Ministry of Planning. We loaded up hundreds of CDs, booklets, papers, and the actual Vision 2020 document itself. It is still archived at Balize House as we speak. So without that, what you had, you were budgeting in a vacuum. That is why the UNC could have spent such significant sums of money outside of a policy framework with nothing to show. And if that doesn't go down as one of the greatest travesties in this country, I don't know what has. And I make the point here today because we're wrapping up 2019 budget to speak. Because a country, we know in a new environment. The president, I don't want to bring the president into the debate, but she said parliamentarians have to come together to help build this country. And if you had a profound document like Vision 2020 and you could not see its value, all you saw was that it was a P&M document. It wasn't written by the leadership of the P&M, you know. It was written by technocrats, scholars, and practitioners in the economy. And, Madam President, as I said, I will be brief. One of my pet peeves in my political career is that incident. I think about it every day. I hurt about it very regularly because this country has regressed and regressed significantly because of that single act. And I just wanted to make the point today, Madam President, that to go on the records in this new House, in this new Senate, to make that point so that the nation will know the truth as to what had happened with Vision 2020. Today, this administration and our party has a Vision 2030. If I should say so myself, it has piggybacked a great deal on Vision 2020. We didn't reinvent the wheel. We basically spread it out 10 more years because we lost that 5 years under the UNC. You didn't lose 5 years, you know. You lose 15 years in the development process in Trinidad and Tobago. And these are some of the things that is done that hurts a country. That hurts a country. Because when you do these things, it doesn't raise a red flag immediately, you know. Nobody knew I took my Hilux van, came down to Planet and took out all the documents, you know, before it went to the Beetham landfill, you know. Okay, but that is the extent to which a new administration could go to catapult the good work of our previous administration. So, Madam President, I used up my introductory time, so I don't have nothing to say about tea and tech, about WASA, about whatsoever is part of this bill. But seeing that I'm still on my introductory time, I think I have the opportunity to so do. Again, I want to say I just had to debate on this first day of the sitting here, and I just wanted to put on record that significant event that I think this country should know about. I thank you.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I thank my colleagues on this side for responding to some of the misinformation that was put out there on the other side, but there are a few things that I need to either reiterate or respond to. Senator Mark, in typical fashion, talked about this administration's overdependence on the central bank for financing, which is the most galling thing you can think of. When you consider that the UNC administration, the People's Partnership Administration, took the overdraft from a credit of $6 billion to a deficit of $9 billion in a period where they had the highest revenue in Trinidad and Tobago ever. Yes, Senator Hussain, we did move the limit from 15% to 20%, but if you compare like with like, it would mean that all we were allowed to do was move the overdraft from $9 billion to a maximum of $10 billion. So consider the $15 billion movement made under the UNC during that period of plenty, and our relatively small $3 billion movement to a maximum of $10 billion. Who was irresponsible? Who was over-relying on the central bank for financing. It certainly was not this administration. Senator Mark made the most astounding suggestion when he said that we should be disconnecting the SALCOT for not paying their URICOT, for not paying their bill to TNTech. What would be the consequence of doing that but us losing access to more water in these difficult times? Obviously, that is not the solution. The solution is to come up with a plan to offset the obligation to the SALCOT versus the obligation due from the SALCOT. And this is what, as the Minister of Public Utilities has said, this is what the administration has been doing. Cutting off the SALCOT, it would be a completely irresponsible thing to do. We keep hearing from Senator Mark and others that the actions of the government is depleting the foreign exchange reserves in Trinidad and Tobago. Nothing could be further from the truth. There was a movement downwards when we first came into government, but that movement has stabilized and has been stable for the last 3 years. The foreign exchange reserve, we have cover of 8 months. That has been in existence since I joined this government, and it continues today. We are managing through the central bank with policy guidance from the Minister of Finance. We are managing the central bank reserves, and we have managed to stabilize it in these difficult times. So the commentators out there and the commentators in here who keep saying we are depleting the foreign exchange reserves are completely wrong. The foreign exchange reserve position is robust, and we will continue to manage it to ensure that it remains in that state. Senator Obika and Senator Mark went on for quite some time blaming this administration for the loss that was incurred in respect of the swap. That as well is astounding. The government of the People's Partnership, under its then Minister of Finance, Senator Hawaii, entered into a swap. And yes, you can say it's insurance, but it is not unreasonable to say it's a gamble. Because what you have is two sides who are taking different positions. If one side guesses correctly, then they will come out on top. If the other side guesses correctly, they would come out on top, but somebody is going to lose. So you have to look at the relative cost of this swap versus what you are proposing to gain. And once you have entered a swap, pulling out is not an easy thing. You have to weigh what it has already cost you versus the relative merits of staying in. So it is not just looking at it and say, yes, you made a bad decision to start with, but having made that, it's like getting into a bad marriage. You don't wake up one day and say, okay, I should not have married this man yesterday, I'm going to divorce him. You try to determine whether there's merit in preserving this relationship. And after some time of reflection and seeking advice and whatever, you make a determination. The swap having been entered into in circumstances when this administration would not have entered into it, we had to assess the merits of determining should we end it and bear the cost because ending it early would have cost, or should we wait and see in the unlikely event that there was an upward swing in the interest rate. And having assessed and sought advice and taken advice, the Minister of Finance did eventually end it. Now the question what one would ask is, did the Minister of Finance under the PP administration seek and take proper advice in terms of getting into the swap in the first place? That is the question. Because when you have somebody the likes of Citibank who is prepared to wager that the interest rate will never exceed this amount, you have to question yourself as to whether your position that it will exceed is a valid position. And obviously Citibank proved right, because in none of the years since the swap was entered into did it cross that threshold. So obviously there was absolutely no merit in pursuing that. Now, if you enter into a swap and you see movement where the interest rate is fluctuating above and below the target amount, you would say, okay, there's merit in taking that gamble. But when you look at the history of the interest rates throughout the period of the swap, in no year did it even ever get close. So what was the basis for the then Minister of Finance entering into the arrangement? That is the question that one should ask. And yes, we lay the blame for the cost of that transaction squarely at the feet of the People's Partnership government. Senator Dion-Ryan raised several issues and asked several questions. The overdraft. We do have cash flow challenges in the government. And what this would be expected to happen when you are relying on a product that is as volatile as oil and gas is. And this is why the policy of the PNM administration prior to 2010 was to create a buffer. This buffer was in NGC, where the policy was to take dividends maximum being a percentage of the profits of the company. So you left NGC in funds to do a couple of things, to continue investing for growth and to give the government some leeway in case there was a fall in the oil and gas prices. We left a buffer in the central bank by leaving a credit amount in the central bank of $6 billion. The problem is when we came back into government after 5 years of the other side being in government, the buffers were gone. So we had no choice but to borrow. When you come into an administration and you are told you have 3 days cover, you cannot pay salaries, there is no choice but to borrow. And to get from there back to the buffer in a period where the prices are still low, they have not attained the heights that they were up to 2014, and the administration of the arms of government collecting your revenue are not as robust and not as efficient as they should be, it is difficult to get back there. But we are working our way towards getting back there. Yes, the options that you have identified to get us out of that are all very valid. We have considered them all as well. Finding other sources of income. Short-term sources of income are difficult. We have found a couple, as we would have indicated to you, the adjustment that we got from the oil companies through renegotiation of the past income positions. The tax amnesty was a boom. All of these things are short-term solutions that have given us some kind of relief. But the real benefit is in pursuing the long-term diversification measures, which we continue to do. Containing expenditure, we have done a very creditable job in doing that, having moved the expenditure from $60 billion a year to $50 billion a year. We have been raising debt as and when we need to. We're trying to contain that as much as possible, but we are trying to do that scenario where we have expenses that we cannot cut much more, and we have development programs that we have to continue doing. Most importantly, from my view, my passion, we have to become more efficient at raising finances. And yes, we can try to do that under the current administration, which we have been trying to do. I would have indicated to this House some time ago that we had an assessment of the tax administration. We got a report, and we have been working with the Inland Revenue to implement the recommendations from that report to improve the administration. But once the tax administration remains within the confines of the public service proper, there will be constraints on recruitment and advancement. And so it is something that we have to seriously take on board and take a concrete and positive position if we are to make any real headway in terms of the finances that we raise. The FIU $7 million tax evasion and the demonetization, I saw both of those as absolute opportunities for the tax administration to improve the income that we receive from revenue, actually take action against people. But given the limitations, it has been minimal. And so we really need a more robust organization if we are to make any real headway. Senator Dial Singh, just a correction, you indicated that the Minister of Finance should not have the authority to transfer funds to different ministries. And I would just like to correct you, he does not have that authority. All he has the authority to do is to allow for transfers within a ministry. So it could be that in the budget presentation, a ministry would have gotten approval to create a new unit, for example, and they got an allocation for that. But they would have decided during the course of the year that no, they may not need that unit. They really should be focusing on their attention on something else. So the same ministry goes to the Ministry of Finance and say, instead of using my funds for this, can I use it for that? So for the AG, for example, the AG intended to set up a public defenders unit. And there may have been delay in the setup of that unit, so the funds that were set aside for that would not all have been used. So the AG comes back to the minister and say, I haven't been able to use all those funds here, can I use it to repair the court in San Fernando? And the Minister of Finance in those circumstances can say, yes, go ahead and do that. So it is not moving it around to ministries. So when we have to move funds from one ministry to another, from one head to another, we do have to come to Parliament to seek approval. Senator Obika is alleging that the P&M administration has to take responsibility for 25 billion of the 31 billion borrowed by the UNC administration. That is the most mind-boggling argument I've ever heard. One, the quote-unquote CLICO debacle would not have been a debacle if it was properly managed by the UNC administration. This was meant to be a short-term loan fully secured by assets, and the amount should have been recovered in fairly short order from the company. This did not happen. All sorts of machinations were entered into to deal with that. At the end, when the P&M came back into power, we had to struggle to get access to the assets that ought to have been held as security because the UNC failed to renew the loan that tied the assets to the liability. So we had to struggle to recover those assets. But we did. And the item that was supposed to have been a short-term loan that ought not to have cost the government 6 years of borrowing and interest payments, we sorted it out through collection of the assets, through the offer of the NIF, which was oversubscribed. That matter could have been dealt with in short order if the UNC had properly managed that. There is also an allegation that the UNC borrowed billions of the $31 billion to settle Petrotrin debt. Petrotrin does have debt, it had debt, it continues to have debt, but my information is that although the government from time to time was requested to provide guarantees in respect of debt and in respect of payments due, the government was not called upon to pay any of Petrotrin's debt. I know that certainly happened during the P&M's administration, and my information is that that's what happened during the UNC information. From the Ministry of Finance is where I got this information. So the $15 billion that Senator Obika ascribes to the government settling Petrotrin debt, I don't know where that came from. Another thing that we need to recognize is, as my colleague, the Minister of Public Utilities, indicated, the government's accounting is done on a cash basis. The fact that we have had savings in certain areas does not mean we have abandoned the program, that we didn't do what we were supposed to do. It just means that we have not got to the point where we are making payments for those things. The implementation may have been slower than expected. The bill may not have been received from the contractor. The request for releases may not have been processed by the Ministry of Finance. So nothing about these adjustments indicate that the programs were abandoned, that we prioritized, that we don't care about children. The Minister of Health came here some time ago and indicated that where, in respect of all valid applications to the Children's Life Funds, for example, the applications were approved, money was disbursed. So we are not ill-treating our children. We are not abandoning our education programs. None of these things are true. We have to remember that in cash accounting, that does not, the fact that there are adjustments does not imply that things were not done. It just means that cash did not pass. That's all it means. But we are under an obligation to come to this place and explain to you why certain costs that we said we would have incurred during the 12 months up to September 2019 were not incurred during that period. It doesn't mean that it will not be incurred. A lot of it will just have to be rolled forward to 2020. And this happens every year. So, as the President has been at pains to remind us today, this bill is about two things. It is about the transfer of funds from the Minister of Public Utilities to the Ministry of Finance. The Minister of Public Utilities went into pains to explain the two main adjustments under his ministry, and we have indicated to the House that the main adjustment into the Ministry of Finance dealt with the settlement of interest payments. That is all this is about. All the other information was just providing you with background on adjustments made within ministries. So in the circumstances, I put that information before you, ask you to support the passage of the bill. I thank you, and I beg to move that bill.
Honourable Senators, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to Vary the Appropriation of the Sum, the issue of which was authorized by the Appropriation Financial Year 2019 Act 2018 and varied by the Finance Supplementary Appropriation Financial Year 2019 Act 2019 be read a second time. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it.
A bill entitled An Act to Vary the Appropriation of the Sum, the issue of which was authorized by the Appropriation Financial Year 2019 Act 2018 and varied by the Finance Supplementary Appropriation Financial Year 2019 Act 2019.
Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Madam President, in accordance with Standing Order 57-2, I beg to move that the bill not be committed to a committee of the whole Senate.
Honourable Senators, the question is that a bill entitled An Act to Vary the Appropriation of the Sum, the issue of which was authorized by the Appropriation Financial Year 2019 Act 2018 and varied by the Finance Supplementary Appropriation Financial Year 2019 Act 2019 not be committed to a committee of the whole Senate. Those in favor say aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. The bill will not be committed to a committee of the whole Senate. Minister in the Ministry of Finance.
Thank you, Madam President. Madam President, I beg to move that a bill entitled An Act to Vary the Appropriation of the Sum, the issue of which was authorized by the Appropriation Finance Year 2019 Act 2018 and varied by the Finance Supplementary Appropriation Finance Year 2019 Act 2019 be now read a third time and passed.
Honourable Senators, the question therefore is that a bill entitled an act to vary the appropriation of the sum, the issue of which was authorized by the Appropriation Financial Year 2019 Act 2018 and varied by the Finance Supplementary Appropriation Financial Year 2019 Act 2019, be now read a third time and passed. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it.
A bill entitled, An Act to Vary the Appropriation of the Sum, the issue of which was authorized by the Appropriation Financial Year 2019 Act 2018 and varied by the Finance Supplementary Appropriation Financial Year 2019 Act 2019.
Leader of Government Business.
Thank you very much, Madam President. Madam President, I beg to move that the Senate do now adjourn to Tuesday, February 4th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m. That will be Private Members' Day, and let me take this opportunity to thank both the opposition and the independent bench in supporting that we do government business today in lieu of private members. So you will have your day next week, Tuesday, and I have been advised by the leader of the opposition business that we'll be doing motion number 6. That's the motion on crime.
Honorable Senators, the question is that this Senate do now adjourn to Tuesday, February the 4th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those against say no. I think the ayes have it. This Senate now stands adjourned to Tuesday, February the 4th, 2020 at 1:30 p.m.